I'd like to thank Jane and Emily and the other organizers at SaskBooks for giving me an opportunity to speak about the history forest. It's a pleasure and an honor to discuss my work. The history forest is a collection of poems and essays, many quite short. Almost all of the book attempts to respond to the complexity of what it means to be alive now. There were so many things that call out for our attention: the ecological crisis, refugees, military conflict, so many things. Years ago, when I started writing, I wrote traditional lyric poetry. By this, I mean that I usually wrote about something that happened to me or my family, or something that I noticed. I still do this, choose a subject and then start writing, but what happens next is that I very quickly lose control of what happens, and I'm very uninterested in writing about me anymore. Let me show you what I mean. My family collects plastic figurines, and here's a small model of one of our prehistoric ancestors, an Australopithecus and her child. These were creatures who lived in Africa over 2 million years ago. Now, I decided that I'd write about this pair, mother and baby, when I realized that they were made out of plastic, which is, of course, an oil product, and I wondered how I call her Lucy, after the famous Australopithecus skeleton of a female found in the 1960s, I wondered what Lucy, would think about us, her descendants, and the world that we've made. This poem is called As Unnoticed as Possible, and it's dedicated to Lucy, our oldest mother. There's almost always two of them, mother and, or mother with, her child up against a tilting shoulder, a breast about to tire, and four separate hands, each gathering its own task, each finger an enunciation of trust, care. And this particular pair, an almost young Australopithecus looking far away down and into the distance, yet beneath and between us, her offspring, a toddler, mesmerized by something looming behind what's already here. This ancestral pair, the color of sun tape over shadow. This pair is factory made from plastic, is conjured from the gasoline haze above the playground in the toy city, an unforeseen cosmopolis done in by polymers. Some in the neonatal intensive care unit, and others inside our luminous and ever-improving toothpaste. River Run, an infinite regress of bodies, these Instagram islands, a floating montage from me across to you, from that jet trail passing instantly to itinerant sea star, to whatever gods hummingbirds once knew, the telepathic and invisible ones. She's anxious for me to learn, panic being something we both know. So a simple poem dedicated to a toy is thus beset by a civilization addicted to products that are destroying it. Now, the book is put together very carefully so that the images reverberate through the collection. People who have walked around Wascana Lake in Regina have likely noticed the memorial statue on the west side near the legislature that is of a small Ukrainian girl. This statue commemorates the Holodomor, the enforced starvation of Ukrainian people by Stalin in the 1930s. As a statue, though, it is linked to the plastic figurine in the poem I've just shared. It's as though Lucy has metamorphosed into the little girl. So this poem that is dedicated to the statue in the park is called This Slender Girl is Too Young. This slender girl is too young to know that the orange belly of the oriole singing behind her matches the prisoner jumpsuits used by both the Americans and ISIS. She's only recently taken her place here, a statue, a true-to-life commemoration of the Holodomor. She standing alongside a man-made lake in Canada's undeserted prairies. Is there a mental illness inherent to statues? Their need to displace air, to occupy where the mind keeps fraying, to be islands that supplicate, to breathe what imagination can't ignite. She's an abandoned souvenir, an exhausted and unwavering resilience that seethes. This poem about the Holodomor thus brings to light one of the central concerns of the collection, to speak about the violence and the beauty of the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the most iconic images of the 20th century is Salvador Dali's Melting Clocks, a painting he titles The Persistence of Memory. Looking at this image one day a little while ago, I was reminded of how glaciers are melting owing to global warming. So I started a poem with this comparison, melting clocks and melting glaciers, but then the poem sort of exploded. So this poem is called Salvador Dali and the Glacier. It's not the persistence, but the forfeit of memory. It isn't clocks, but the future that's been melting. The 20th century keeps gathering itself, dying. Homo faber. There was a time when talking dolls, automatic elevators, and hearing aids were new, marvelous. Today has its own brand of new. Let's make a deal and see if Antarctica's shrinking Thwaites Glacier falls out behind door number 3, face down, embarrassed, and set spinning adrift across the floor. The future is pitiless and melting. One of our dirtiest little secrets, this endless fondness for endless delay. From an illegally downloaded inflatable raft for refugees to huffing model airplane glue to the mobile appendectomy app, there are simply too many time bombs to contain. The private pathways of a mountain gorilla sanctuary not excluded. Recall the ancient submarine missile Exocet. This is cardiac ischemia. This is predictable as AI, and moody too. This is Gutenberg's invention of consensual memory, people ferrying auditory hallucinations. A masterpiece and an optimist by nature, the ocean is asphyxiated amid unborn people who are marooned inside what we do and what we don't do. Squandering the poor is perfectly legal and technically simple. What's here now isn't finished with its rage for collapse. Ice is losing its various names, and it's not only avian malaria that's on the rise. I've never been here before. Have you? Has anyone? We live as though there's an inescapable clause in our human contract stating that even moon dust requires the accompanying paw prints of an apex predator. A Schleich jaguar will do, and the awaited appearance of some unrecognizable creature, a mumbling Jesus, come round at last, and then abandoned where the horizons suddenly become a landfill. Here we enter the newest of possible worlds, charismatic as Thanatos, richly undocumented, and finally illustrated with the precision of pixels beginning to sag. nor forget Homo faber, to plant each grave with an imperishable acorn to offset both the Fabergé egg and the flimsy rescue attempt of everyone's improbable vanishing, as we eventually hear ourselves as outcasts swarming to stay. But not all of the book is this bleak. As mentioned, there's so much beauty. So let me now read a little bit from a short essay that I wrote in the summer of 2020 when our society was first encountering COVID. My family and I like to go to Buffalo Pound Provincial Park. We went there a few times that year. I do need to mention, though, that in the spring of 2020, I had a kind of breakdown and needed to be hospitalized. So this piece is called We're Left Beginning. We're left beginning with three kinds of beauty: natural beauty, artistic beauty, and whatever passes for care between fellow creatures, whether in marriage, friendship, or a crowd. Sustaining this long friendship with you, Consolare, has marked me with unanticipated gifts, and even though we meet only occasionally, you've taught me that it's best for words, like days, to begin and then end, simply. Yesterday, my wife Amy and my youngest son Jacob, a neighbor who gardens, and I went down the Trans-Canada Highway to Buffalo Pound, a provincial park that's recently opened, except for the boardwalk that ventures deep into a marsh for birders. Amy and Jacob went mountain biking. Surprisingly, there are indeed some steep hills in Saskatchewan. And the recently divorced neighbor went off on her own to hike, and I set out with binoculars and scope, a high-powered sort of mini telescope on a tripod. We drive to this park several times a year because the marshes are our favorite spot for migrating birds. Because the boardwalk has been closed owing to COVID, viewing birds without the scope was difficult. Set up on a hill overlooking the lake, the scope shows many species of waterfowl, including some that I'd never seen here before, a northern pintail. And then, hello, a large brown mass in the distance turns into a juvenile moose wading across the lake. I then turned away from the marsh and strolled in the prairie. I noticed a pair of birds perched on some scrub quite a ways away. They looked like eastern kingbirds from a distance, but with binoculars and then the scope, they turned into mountain bluebirds. I'd seen a pair before in the park, but not here. They came closer, allowing me to take in the extraordinary tints and hues of the male's feathers in flight, or sitting on a barbed wire fence. Now, I don't know if you've seen bluebirds before, but they're a sentient variety of blues, purples, blacks, in glow and dab in a kind of swim song of even yet another blue, not remotely turquoise, but resonant of it. I haven't been so delighted to live inside a color since seeing Bregel's Green Sky in the painting Hunters in the Snow some years ago. The bird's beauty arrived in waves, almost lifting the prairie grass into the sky. Jesus, Mike, tone it down. Go deep behind the thicket of necessary words. Go back to the scope again and look ever so intricately at the bird's claws on the barbed wire fence, both animate and inanimate objects, a curl of sharp, and return to the black eyes, be seen by them, and ignored. Birds aren't here to give me any kind of grace, but they do give grace, and they make me feel part of the world again. What does it feel like to fly? Not fly in order to escape, but the choice to open wings, to move from scrub to branch to nearby fence. Perhaps simply this: to have a memory of being released from confinement to freedom, the egg that nurtured became too tight. Perhaps to fly is to have the memory of breaking loose and instantly to have air do your bidding, dart through an opening in light spectrum that's imperceptible to us. I'd come with my wife and son to the park a few weeks ago, just days after getting out of a bit less than a week's stay in the psych ward. On that trip to the park, I saw a female kingfisher perched on the railing on the boardwalk, again from a distance. Kingfishers have a totally different kind of blue than bluebirds, and I'd never seen a female in the park before, and I was pleased for her that COVID had kept the humans away from where she likely had a nest. But I was only half there spiritually. It's as though when I looked through the scope at the lake in front of me to see the kingfisher, there was also a narrow, vertical band of something missing off to the right. Picture a long, straight line of light. But the line wasn't made of light, so much it was a shaft of non-color, non-presence, as though something on the other side of what's visible had been sucked away, the space holding whatever this line was. Yesterday, there wasn't anything missing, as it were, so I guess things can mend. Seeing the bluebirds, I realized I don't deserve it, but never have I felt so rescued. And yet, not to ignore, never ignore even once what's happening all around us, from what's alive inside people, to insects, to the bulrushes upon which a yellow-headed blackbird sways. So along with the difficulties we face, there's so much beauty. So I'd like to thank Jane and Emily and SaskBooks, and thank you for watching this video.